Welcome back. You're watching Newscentre. The World Bank is changing to operate faster at scale and cut out bureaucracy. That's the word coming in from World Bank's Managing Director of Operations, Anna Bjerde. Speaking to me earlier, Bjerde said World Bank's upcoming strategy for gender parity will be focused on developing women leaders and entrepreneurs. She also added that easy access to land and ease of opening and closing businesses can lead to greater private investment in India. Here's a slice of that exclusive conversation.
The outlook for global growth, I'm afraid, is not great. And we just came out with a forecast recently that sets the outlook for growth for 2024 at about 2.4%. I should tell you that this means that it's being pulled up by some growth that we're seeing in emerging markets, which is great. But overall, that level of growth is not going to help the world recover at the pace that we need it to recover. Now, turning to India, India actually has quite high growth. We estimate between 6 and 7%, which compared to this global outlook, of course, puts India in a pretty favorable position. Now, I do know that India has aspirations to become a high-income country, a developed country by 2047, and our estimates indicate that India would need to grow at about 8% per annum to get there. So there's a bit more work to be done, but on pretty strong foundations.
All right. Now, one of the major tasks that you are involved in is the reform of the bank. Ajay Banga, when he took over, the first thing that he said that his priority would be to reform the World Bank to make it bigger, better, make it respond faster to future challenges, including pandemics. Where are we with the reform process right now? Where does India's cooperation come in? What are you expecting from India on that front? Are you setting any timelines on this reform?
Yes. So I like to say that we're on the move. And we're very much on the move under the leadership of a new president, of course, Ajay Banga, who was born and raised here in India. And he's bringing in really a reinvigorated energy into our organization, a lot of it inspired, of course, by his private sector background. But let me give you a couple of examples where we are. So what we very much have recognized and acknowledged is that the world is changing at a fast pace. We've had years now of crisis upon crisis, and it requires institutions like ours to really look inwards and say, are we fit for fight to be able to help our clients meet the challenges of the future? So one of the things that we have done is to come out with a new vision and mission for our institution, which essentially says we are going to end poverty on a livable planet. And the on the livable planet is actually new. And what that means is that we're going to double down, as we always have felt is our mandate, poverty reduction, but we're also paying huge amounts of attention now to the planet that we live on. And that's pretty encompassing in that, of course, it's about climate change, but it's also about access to clean air, clean water, dignity, human development, services.
What is the biggest challenging in reforming the World Bank? You said that we need a large amount of resources. So if I were to ask you about one or two key challenges that you see that need to be overcome, what would those be?
So I think we need to definitely recognize that the needs around the world for finance is huge. And no single institution, including the World Bank, can provide this on themselves. We need to be bigger, yes, at the World Bank. And we need to be bigger both through our public sector arm, if you will, but also because we have IFC and MIGA, which provide incredible products and instruments to mobilize the private sector. So we need to, this is an opportunity, we need to work much more effectively as a One World Bank group. And here what I think is great, we now have two very senior people in our Delhi office, our country director here, and also the IFC regional director for South Asia is here in India. And I think having these two senior people will help us for South Asia, but also particularly for India. So we need to work more effectively as one group. And this is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge because we work differently, because public-private works differently, but we have to do this better. That's one. Secondly, staying on the need for resources, we need to work really effectively with our partners outside of the World Bank Group. And this is where we have really been focusing on looking at other multilateral development institutions, whether it is the Asian Development Bank, whether it is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, to see what are some of the overlapping areas we're trying to address in the regions we work, and how do we together focus on those so that we can bring more resources towards a common set of challenges and get more scaled impact.
Right.
And then finally, maybe, if I may, The private sector. Our president created this private sector investment lab to really learn from the private sector what does it take to invest in emerging markets. And I think private sector mobilization for development will be key going forward.
Right. I would also like to ask you about future areas of lending which will be a priority.
So I think what we have recognized and we see is that there are a certain set of global challenges around the world which affect globally, but they also affect countries specifically. Some of these we talked about, climate change, fragility, pandemics, but it also goes to things like human development. We've seen actually a backtracking in many of the human development indicators, so doubling down on education, health, nutrition is one area, but also access to services, water, energy, sanitation. So I would see going forward, we need to work on these global issues, climate, fragility, pandemics, and I see every country I travel to, it's also priorities at the country level, but some countries still have a development trajectory, so we need to still work on some basics, access to energy, access to water. So I see us focusing more, but making sure that we focus both on these emerging and pressing global issues, but also country-specific development priorities to take them to the final mile.
Right. In terms of helping India meet its climate goals, the World Bank last year approved a $1.5 billion program for India's energy transition. This includes green hydrogen as well. Where are we in terms of deploying the funds, and how are you working with the Indian private sector on that as well?
Yeah. So energy transition is something that pretty much every country is thinking through. And I would say particularly a country like India, where you have a huge population, 1.4 billion people, high growth, and we know with growth also comes a need for energy. So energy consumption tends to go hand in hand with economic growth. And India has already transitioned quite a bit. I believe 40% of installed capacity is new and renewables, but there's more that can be done. And what's exciting about this package, the $1.5 billion package, which is actually part of a broader package of about $4 billion, is the transition towards continued on renewable energy, but also some foundations that the private sector will need in order to come and invest. And that includes things like investment in transmission and distribution, because without that, it's hard to get the private sector to come in and invest in generation. On the green hydrogen side, really exciting what India is doing, and I'm actually sharing when I travel often India's experience, because what India is trying to do with the green hydrogen is to address hard-abating industries where it's very difficult to decarbonize, but green hydrogen can be a solution. So this is very exciting, like heavy industries and manufacturing. So this, I think, is exciting. The other thing is, of course, making sure that the hydrogen is focused on green, so that's where the renewable energy comes in. But it's really all about making sure that we can deploy the technologies, spur the demand, and look at policies that are conducive to investments in these new emerging technologies.
Right. You've had meetings with the finance minister, with the railway minister, Ashwini Vaishnav. There has been an interest about having the World Bank invest in certain infrastructure projects in India, invest through InvITs as well. What is the level of interest? What did the Indian government ask you in terms of help, support, and what is the World Bank keen on doing in terms of collaborating on future projects?
Yeah. So I think investment in infrastructure is still a huge priority here in India, and particularly investment in infrastructure and logistics. So we talked a lot about longer-term financing for infrastructure, and what are some of the tools and instruments that already exist, and how can the World Bank provide support with the focus really of leveraging so that there's more volume of resources. So again, it's very good that we have our two directors here focus both on the policies that we can think about that are conducive, but also the private sector arm of the World Bank that actually can take the investments into the private sector to increase the volume by leveraging. Just to give you one example, some of the investments that we have been supporting in solar, for every dollar we've been able to leverage 40 times. So this idea of leveraging is hugely important for volume. But I think the conversations have been great, focusing really on making sure that this growth ambition of India can be materialized through World Bank support, public-private, finance, knowledge. But ultimately, I also have to acknowledge that a lot of our time was spent talking about India's leadership during its G20 process, because India actually oversaw some very good recommendations coming out from multilateral development institutions, through the independent expert group. And I really commended also the authorities for that work, because we're benefiting for that as we reform our own institution.
Right. Now, when you speak about investments in infrastructure, would there be certain sectors within this that would be of immediate interest where you feel that the World Bank can come in and support?
Yeah, so I think continuing on the renewable energy path will be very important. And again, we have a package there. Secondly, we discussed with the Minister of Railways, Digital and Communication the importance of logistics, but also the railway connectivity of the country. We're very happy to support here. We also discussed digital here. The digital infrastructure is very strong, but we talked about how do we make sure we get the services out there. And again, here I might make a plug for some of the work that I've been looking at on the female entrepreneurship side, which is the financial inclusion side, and using the internet and digital solutions for female labor force participation to be able to generate and stimulate that. So we talked about all kinds of ways of adding value in the benefit of increasing growth and creating jobs, essentially.
Right. When you speak about inclusion, the World Bank is coming up with a new strategy for reducing the gender gap. India, the labor workforce participation, when you speak about women, is around 37%. What is this new strategy going to do for countries like India?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say that the focus on female labor force participation is very compelling. And according to analysis that we've done, if India brings it up to 50%, we can add about 1% to GDP. That is, in an economy the size of India, that's like huge. So I would really encourage to focus on female labor force participation. Our new gender strategy is actually very exciting, and I think it's quite timely, because it focuses on a number of barriers that we need to continue to address to reduce the gap between women and men when it comes to access and equality. And just to give you one data point that keeps me up at night around the world, which is if women and men started companies at the same pace, so women started companies at the same pace as men, and these companies thrived, we could add 20% to global GDP. This is significant amount, and we could use that growth right now. So I'm very focused on economic empowerment for women, but it usually means we need to look at what are some of the obstacles. So are the obstacles in the education and skills category? Are the obstacles in services, which is one thing our strategy, forthcoming strategy, will focus on, which is women actually need a certain level of services to be able to fully participate. Often we talk about childcare, but also elderly care in many societies. So that's something very important. Now, one pillar that makes me super excited about this new strategy is that we're also focusing on developing women leadership, whether it's in the public sector, the private sector, or it's actually developing entrepreneurs. So I think there's a lot of work we can do here. The gaps will not go away by themselves. They need really concerted efforts, both policies and investments.
All right. Significantly, the World Bank's next strategy in terms of women empowerment and bridging the gender gap would be to develop women leaders, women entrepreneurs, and increase the participation of women in services. We're going to take a short break at this point, but don't go anywhere. The news continues on CNBC-TV18.